caste mean to you? Seems like it's the perennial stick used to beat Hindus and Hinduism. The caste accusation is often unceremoniously dumped on the head of a Hindu child with the patronizing phrase, "But you Hindus have the caste system." That can be a cringeworthy experience, capable of shaming and shutting down any honest discourse. Unless, of course, you know what it actually means. But how could you, since there isn't an agreed-upon definition of caste? Is it even a Hindu thing? Or could it have been foisted upon an unsuspecting native population during a moment of weakness under a colonial power? And if so, to what purpose? Well, by the end of this video, you'll have a much better understanding of caste, why it's the weapon of choice to dismantle Hinduism, and hopefully you'll be able to talk back. Namaste and welcome to Citti Media. Our guests today are Pandit Satish Sharma, a civilizational analyst and a scholar of comparative theology, and Dr. Deepika Singh Ahlawat, a historian who specializes in the politics of historical narratives. She's also a museum curator with a focus on the history of early modern India. Panditji, Deepikaji, welcome, and wonderful to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Pranamji, namaskar, Jai Shri Ram. A pleasure to be here.
Great. No, you're welcome. It's good to have two experts today to help us understand this whole issue. Let's start off with some basics first. On the one hand, we have caste, an incredibly politicized demarcation of society, which first appears in India during the colonial period. Then on the other hand, we have Jati, Varna, and other ways of stratifying society, which are indigenous and existed prior to the arrival of the colonizers. Panditji, can we start off with you? If you could explain the difference between all these terms.
A wonderful place to start. And in fact, this is probably the one area which is the most responsible for much of the confusion, the conflation of terms, the misunderstanding of terms. One person says caste when they mean jati, one person says birth when they mean hereditary. And so all of these have contributed to the current confusion. And in that confusion, an awful lot of harm has been done. So it's a great place to start. Now, caste is the title of the talk, and caste is where you started. Caste means class. It is the Portuguese word. It simply means class, as applied to species, as applied to categorizations of human beings. For example, in the Americas, caste paintings exist where they depict a mulatto as a particular caste and all sorts of categorizations. But in essence, it means class. And that could actually be the beginning and end of all of these conversations. If the authorities and the activists and those who want to push legislation into place were to abandon the word caste, which is Portuguese, and adopt the word class, which is English, which is not an unreasonable request in terms of the languages that we're all using, then everything would be okay. But that's not what people want. They want this word caste. And there is a reason behind that, and we have seen this demonstrated. Caste is no longer an adjective. It's become a brand, and it's become a negative brand. It's become a hate brand. And attached to it is a mountain of verbiage and literature, atrocity literature, all sorts of things, and they're all attached to this one word, caste. And that is why they won't let go. So this is not about justice. The moment you transpose if you change the word caste into class, it all disappears. And you can't then hang it around just the Hindu community. You can't then make it about India. But justice would be dispensed. If the word class was in place, justice would be dispensed if discrimination occurred. And I've raised this point with legislators and politicians, and they always look blankly because there is no answer to it. And the intention I deduce from that particular point is that there is malice behind this. And that then opens up the exchange and the conversation. We do not have an equivalent word. There was an attempt to try and define this word caste as hereditary, hierarchical, and endogamous. That's what the British institutions tried to establish with it. Although that's not a definition that's been universally accepted. And we do not have a phenomenon of a hereditary hierarchical social structure behind a particular word to identify it. We have Jati, which is akin to guilds. They're the mechanism whereby knowledge and expertise and skills are transferred generation to generation, people to people. They're the repositories of civilizational knowledge. We have Varna, and Varna is very clear. The closest word that I can find to Varna is probably archetypes or attribute-based archetypes. And then we have a whole host of others, more precise with each one. Kul, Parampara, the other groupings that we use, Gotras and so on and so forth. And each of those has its own meaning, but none of them are actually relevant to this particular conversation. So I hope that's made things a little clearer.
No, it has. It's great. Deepika ji, is there anything you want to add to that?
Of course, Panditji has explained this beautifully. When we get into discussion of how jatis fit within the Varna structure, which I think is really important when we talk about the lived reality of life in India, I also wish to say this pyramidical hierarchical structure is actually, a lot of it has been imposed by foreigners describing India. So one of the first accounts is Al-Biruni, then Abul Fadl under Akbar does it, because remember, the Mughals are primarily foreigners at that point, and they're trying to describe India like this strange place, which they have to codify and taxonomize, which the British do later in the 18th and 19th century also. So these are foreigner gazes on India, in which they're trying to understand the complexity of millions of people's lives in an extremely diverse country. And they do it in the simplest and most rudimentary form. And unfortunately, the Indian state and all Indian pedagogy about and academic attempts about India adopt those foreign descriptions of what India is as being the truth about India.
You have actually spoken about the fact that Hinduism has myriads of scriptural texts, none of which mention caste, but some do refer to Varna. To what extent did these have a bearing on the ground reality of how society was organized before the colonizers arrived, either the Mughals or the British?
Panditji will, of course, expand on it much better, because he will probably know more about Hindu texts than I do. But I think from an academic point of view, it's really important to understand that Hinduism does not have a scripture in the sense of the Abrahamic religions, that there is no one book that you can call upon that this is the law book of the Hindus. There isn't. And trying to draw a parallel between that, which was the basis of the Hindu code of law that the British formulated, they came upon the Manusmriti as being, oh, this must be the Hindu book of law, that this is the way the Hindus live. But actually, that is completely untrue. Historically, there's no sort of mention of the Manusmriti being used as a source of authority for imposing social order in India. And it may have been true in Bengal at some point, because Bengal, by the time the British were making laws about India, was not very Indian at all, because it had become this interlocutor-led society. Because I don't know how many of the readers will know that the British, because the Diwani of Bengal was one of the first land conquests by the British in the 18th century, and the Battle of Plassey is well known, and all of that. But one of the things they tried to do was to reorganize the way land holdings worked in Bengal. And they tried to replicate the British countryside feudal system. So the zamindars became essentially direct sort of parallels of aristocrats in Britain, including sort of having servitude to a king. This is not the way traditional zamindari, traditional landholding works in India. In the Kshatriya-led order, which is the people who hold the right to rule in India, and I will talk about who is a Kshatriya later on, they make the rules about society. They sort of talk to Brahmins and figure out, hey, what did this person say about it? What did that person say about it? And what applies to the modern day. But nowhere in India does a Brahmin sit and say, hey, you're going to make this, you're going to live like this. Nowhere. Brahmins are not power holders. And where some person who was born a Brahmin happens to be a power holder, which is the case in the Peshwas in 18th century India, or the Brahmin rulers of Banaras, for example, we see that they are deemed to be Kshatriya because they are assuming Kshatriya roles. They are fighting and ruling, which are not Brahmin activities. So they are assuming Kshatriya roles, and they're assumed to live. They are expected to live by the Kshatriya codes that exist in the land. So I don't know whether that was meandering, but the takeaway should be that there are many, many smritis in India, not just the Manusmriti, and none of them governed how actually laws were written, made, and followed in Indian principalities and Indian ruled states.
That's so interesting.
If I can, yes, that's a wonderful way of introducing this extra dimension. And that is that we were not scripture driven. We did not have edicts which said, thou must do this or thou shalt not do this. That wasn't the way we looked at existence. We were a darshan driven society. And a darshan is more of a revelation or an insight. It is a moment of aha. It's a moment of understanding through seeking. And so darshana-based existence is totally different to book-based, edict-driven existence. In fact, I was having a chat with a group of students the other day, and they asked me, well, what were the principles? If we didn't have a book, how did we guide anything at all? And I said, well, we had the biggest book in all of existence. The front cover of our book was wisdom. The rear, the last page, the last cover in our book was actually love or prem. And in between, we had all of existence. And so we could read the book of all of existence being guided only by wisdom and affection and love and compassion. And that was the only constraint. That was built on the assumption that to be a human being is a good thing, that divinity eventually incarnates in this form so it can experience the height of all experiences and then transcend being incarnated at all. And so to be a human being was a great thing on the journey of self-discovery and understanding, and the conclusion would be to be a pure experience of Anand. And that is the breadth of vision. Within those two covers, we have the capacity for human beings to express everything. Those are the two simplest principles, which is why we have the most diverse art forms. We have the most diverse cuisine. We have the most diverse garments. We have, even in this day, I am continuously amazed that my wife will go and buy a sari, knowing that there is no other sari on the planet which looks like it. That is a simple observation of the diversity. And that's only possible when you have goodness in the heart of human beings. And the assumption is that they can be relied upon to do good things. And so they don't need to be driven into these narrow, book-based, edict-driven ideologies. And so if that's the case, we have the fluidity as well. And that fluidity is something that we're going to start to speak about a little bit later on. But I'm so pleased that Deepika ji has introduced the idea that, one, we do not have a link between scripture, defined rules, norms, and therefore the caste issue cannot have emerged from scripture. Not only are we bound by scripture, so we couldn't be tied into a caste-based system, but caste itself as a concept is totally contrary to a darshan-based society. The two cannot coexist. They are fundamentally polar opposites.
What you've described is such a beautiful, amazing way of existence. I wonder, how did caste then become such a dominant, weaponized narrative of contemporary Hindu society? I mean, there must have been a tremendous level of internalization of this supposedly hierarchical structure that was imposed during the colonial period. And as a society, what kind of weakened and demoralized state do you have to be in order to accept an oppressor's characterization of your own identity, Panditji?
Well, that's something that I'm sure Deepika ji will be able to flesh out in more detail, but I'm going to share two aspects which I stumbled across. One is the understanding of who we were within Bharat amongst Bharatiyas was actually very, very narrow. it was like received instructions that this is who you are, this is what your history says, these are the events in history which support this, and you will accept this. And that, by and large, was still the attitude until a very short while ago. Once we started to explore our own history, then other ideas started to appear. The revelation that a Varna-based society cannot produce a caste system becomes clear once you understand and explore what Varna means. But the second point I wanted to establish was that my own research into this was outside of Bharat. And because they foisted or attempted to foist this whole caste concept on the British Hindu community, I started to delve into some of the areas and some of the events and some of the records which were in evidence and dated back to that particularly difficult time when the whole of Bharat was under the cloud of British colonialism. What entered into that cloud and what emerged from that cloud are two different cultures and two different civilizations. And there was such an awful lot of pain and suffering in that time. But one of the things I did discover was that the British themselves left records whereby they acknowledge that they were responsible for the caste system in their own terms, and they acknowledged that it was a terrible thing. R.L. Middleton, he was conducting the census in the Northwest Frontier province. He makes it crystal clear. He writes, "We asked people what their caste were, and if they didn't know what their caste were, we shoehorned them into an occupational caste." And then he writes, "This system that we abhor so much, we are responsible for." And that's an extraordinary admission from a colonizing administrator. The other thing that I discovered was in 1844, when a group of missionaries were talking about the fact that they were not able to penetrate for conversionary purposes into the structures of India because of what they described as caste being this incredible institution of India. That's their words. Missionaries were describing it in that form. So what I wanted to bring into the space was the notion that Bharat's understanding of its own social history was grossly incomplete and at odds with records that we had unearthed. And the second thing that I wanted to introduce into the dialogue and the conversation was that there is no scriptural link between caste and Sanatani scriptures. This is an important issue because that connection has been alleged, it has been trumpeted, and even to this day we hear so many people who talk about the Hindu caste system. Okay, so it's become an assumed truth which nobody bothers to interrogate anymore. And yet the evidence that we have produced clearly establishes that there is no connection between Sanatani scriptures and a hereditary hierarchical endogamous system. It doesn't sanction it, it doesn't bless it, it doesn't recommend it, it's unnatural. And so that's something that we needed to recognize. One of the interesting things that I also discovered, just as an aside, was that the East India Company hated the notion that the church would ever get into India. You know, they had a perfectly good exploitation and extortion scam running there. And they knew that they were going to have difficulty if the missionaries started to tamper and tinker with day-to-day religious life of the country. It wasn't until 1814 that the missionaries were given access to India. They tried until 1844 with hardly any penetration, as recorded by Father Roberts, who was a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, whose records I managed to get hold of. And then just think, from 1844 to 1857, that's all the time it took for them to suddenly cause enough ruckus and disruption for the mutiny, the Sepoy Mutiny, as they call it, the First War of Independence, to occur. And so the East India Company were actually right. They should never have let these fellows in. And it's principally because of the interference in the moral, religious and spiritual life of India that the independence movement then started.
Why aren't we taught any of this as we're growing up? As a culture, we seem to just accept that we have this caste system and it's a terribly unjust structure that somehow is our fault several generations later. There's really no recourse to question that assumption.
Well, I studied that dimension to quite a degree as to why was it done, how was it done, and how was it perpetuated. And you know, we have a tradition which is particularly unpleasant and pernicious. they have been instilling into the human heart the sense of guilt for the best part of 2 millennia. They are masters at instilling guilt. And we have all grown up with this subliminal sense of guilt that, this was a terrible thing. It's part of our past. It's traumatic. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. And who wants to delve into something which causes so much unhappiness and sadness and fear? We don't go into those things. So people genuinely were averse to exploring this because of the potential trauma that it would unleash. But having done that now, there is a tsunami gathering on the horizon. And the truth of what was done and how it was done is being explored. Conversations are happening. Groups who were so hateful of each other are now beginning to realize that they need to sit down and have these conversations and these difficult conversations. So we will be revealing and rewriting history according to the reality from our perspective over the next decade or so. And I'm hoping that within the next couple of decades, we will revert back to a pre-caste environment where we have dissolved caste consciousness. That's the solution, to dissolve caste consciousness. And that I think we can do.
So room for optimism then.
Always.
That's good to hear.
And the last principle is that we are firmly established in the understanding of Punarjanam. So if we don't do it in this lifetime, we'll come back in the next lifetime and carry on. So we will fix this sooner or later.
True. Deepika ji, you specialize in the reality of how people lived in pre-colonial India and who were the power holders. Tell us more about the Jati structure of that period so we can get an understanding, a good picture of how society lived before the colonizers arrived.
I'm going to qualify that I specialize in a small part of India as an Indian, especially who knows a little bit about India. I mean, the first thing we must acknowledge is that in one lifetime, no one can know everything about India. I certainly do not. So I make no claims about that. Only about a very small part of India and a very small time period. And that's all my capacity enables me at this time. And if I keep learning throughout my life, I will know a little bit, no more, but not all of it. But I just want to digress a little bit about the nature of history writing. It's easy to write history with colonial records, which is why most people continue to parrot and reparrot all the colonial taxonomies based on colonial records. They're written in English. Most Indians who go into the academic system, their first language is English. They find it easier to read, and colonial records are better maintained. If you really want to write indigenous history, you have to go and study local and vernacular records, which is infinitely harder. I did my PhD based on vernacular records, so I can tell you it takes, I could read an India office file. I could read 100 pages in one day. It took me a week often to read one page from a vernacular text because it's coded and it's written for people who are in that communication. It's not really meant to be read by anyone else except people who are doing that business. In this case, account books. So that is why history is written, because sometimes the reasons are not deep or detailed or even malicious. They're based on pettiness, like the logistics. It's easier to write history based on colonial sources. But is it the right history? The answer is no, because it's a very narrow understanding for foreigners' gaze of India. And those foreigners often don't speak the language, have been shipped in from school in Britain. Hey, go rule over this 1,000 square kilometers of a foreign country. And their understanding is that of a TikToker going to India and trying to make hey, this is what India is. So their minds are no more expansive than a backpacker going to India today. They do not know more about India. They do not speak the language. They are not specialists. And yet we treat their accounts as if they must be the greatest route in the world. They are not. That's one thing. What was the question that you asked me? Sorry, my digression got extra long.
No, it's okay. I was asking you to talk about the way power was distributed amongst the Jatis and how society functioned before the British arrived.
Let me make it clear as an academic that are we trying to say that India does not have any discrimination against anyone? No, that's not true. Societies may have a philosophical understanding that you shouldn't have a discrimination. As Panditji said, yes, we are based on karma and punarjanam. So the idea that if you do ill karma against someone, you're probably likely, the idea that you're probably likely to suffer the same sort of ill karma from them in another life is a living idea that forms and informs behavior, certainly. But in practical terms, does discrimination occur? Of course it does. It's human nature. If you live as a very good Hindu, you will live like a sant, as in you will not try to harm any jeev whatsoever. That is the attempt, not accrue any extra pap or any extra rin than those that we are forced to accrue. But human nature decrees that there is discrimination. Often there is systemic discrimination. Yes, that is true. But is it based on some kind of scripture-based caste or one system? No, it is not. And the period of Indian history that I study, for example, the 18th century and the 19th century, we are still looking at an extremely fluid jati sort of fluctuation in terms of power holding. So, for example, the biggest rulers of 18th century in India, who in fact ruled India in the 18th century, the majority of it, were the Marathas. Now, who are the Marathas? They're not a homogeneous community or a jati. They're formed of very different community packings, very different jati identities, who come together from a certain part of India and decide that, hey, we don't like being ruled by Islamists, so essentially the Mughals were, and we're going to go and form and carve out our own samrajya, which is what they end up doing. So this is a fairly well-known fact. Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj is a Kanabi. So they're all cultivators. Some of them are cowherds. Some of them, all have different sort of professions which would be defined as Shudra within a classical Varna structure under certain definitions. But they all become Kshatriya. They assume Kshatriya roles. They're expected to follow Kshatriya codes of honor by the traditional owners of Kshatriya status, which is the Rajputs in North India. So when they find that a Maratha ruler or a leader hasn't performed, or he did some looting, or he did something or the other, say he did not behave in a Kshatriya way. We can see that in the correspondence and records, which means to say, although there was no endogamy or there was no intermarriage between the Rajputs and the Marathas, and the reasons for that are different and complex. Although there was an attempt that could have happened had things not gone other way. So it's not as if they did not explore the concept of let's get these two Kshatriya communities linked up. But that didn't happen in the 18th century. But they did accept them as being fellow Kshatriyas. So the fact that because they were ruling and they were holders of power. So let's look at, and this continued even when the British had written a caste system, an entire trope about, hey, this is what India is with a strict caste system. Sayaji Rai Gaikwad, who is one of the most influential and most progressive and genius ruler by any terms, he was the ruler of Baroda from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. He lived as a cowherd. He was from the Gaikwad family of Baroda. He lived as a cowherd till he was 12 years old. Because that is who the Gaikwads are. Gaikwad means people who look after cows, like Gopals. So that's the history of the Jati structure. And then he goes on to become one of India's most powerful rulers, one of the most enlightened rulers. I mean, he sets up universal adult suffrage and universal education, including women, with moving libraries, the rest of it, you know that. So he was a cowherd, and then he becomes a Kshatriya ruler. So, and one of the, if people want to delve into it in detail, I suggest reading this book by Nicholas Dirks, and he writes about a small principality in South India called Pudukkottai. And it is about, I'm talking about North India, this is the same, exactly the same thing in South India, which is communities which hold the power to rule, assume Kshatriya status. The rulers of Pudukkottai are from a community who is considered a lower and backward community, even 100 miles from Pudukkottai. So Jati structure allows Jatis to assume power, and that changes their Varnic identification. So if this is the one takeaway from this talk, you should take that in the practice of living in India, Jatis did not have a fixed Varnic stratification. Their role and definition depended upon the role that they were performing in the society. And there was great flux. Jatis from untouchable communities, Shudra communities, cultivating communities, all assumed Kshatriya status at some point because they assumed political power and the right to rule. And also Brahmins did that as well, as I mentioned, the Peshwas. They became Kshatriyas. And the rulers of Mewar, who are the primary Rajput rulers, who are considered to be the primary holders of Kshatriya status from the 8th century onwards, their origins are Brahmins. Their sort of genealogy links them to Brahmin origins, but they assume Kshatriya rule. They become a Kshatriya because they are ruling. So that is the truth of the lived reality of how Varna and Jati interrelated in power holding in India.
That's an incredibly complex, fluid, flexible system. It's so different from what we're led to believe. I mean, if you look at the current times, caste is now being brought into the limelight, and there's a lot of narratives constructed around it as this entrenched, oppressive facet of Hindu society. You know, that we alluded to this, the classic pyramid structure. Where did that come from? I mean, who devised that pyramid? And how does it feed into the caste rhetoric that we see on social media today? Because that has real world consequences. Panditji, do you have any thoughts on that?
A number of thoughts. And Deepika ji, thank you so much for sharing that deep dive into that time period. I'd come across some elements of it. I skirted through Dirk's book in my research as well. But my findings were exactly the same, that there was a huge level of fluidity. I also uncovered a work by Professor Mani Shankarji, in which he revealed that 400 of the 605 principalities and kingdoms which were extant when the British arrived were ruled by Shudra kings. And in my book, I write that one of the most famous mandirs where Ramakrishna Paramahansa did his seva was actually constructed by a Shudra queen, Rani Rajmohini. And so, it was quite commonplace for people to adopt rulership according to ability and need of the time, and not be prevented by this notion of a hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous, rigid, inflexible structure, which, as I said, is completely unnatural and therefore contrary to a Darshan-based premise. So the point that I wanted to establish also was the British, in their own words, confirmed that they created this hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous trope. I wanted to know whether it was accidental or whether it was by malice. That would be a useful thing to determine. And to cut the long story short, I can prove that it was by malice. In 1859, we had the British over in the North Americas. They were in constant battles with the Iroquois Indians. And the number of times that they would invite the Iroquois to come to have conferences, to have some sort of a powwow or whatever, and then slaughter them, was so large that the Iroquois coined the term that white man speaks with a forked tongue. That's where it came from, the battles with the Iroquois Indians. White man speaks with a forked tongue in 1859. And that was the British who were engaged in this deceit. And it may be of interest to your viewers to know that of the 463 treaties that the white Christian settlers entered into with the Native Americans, they broke each and every contract. There was not a single one that they adhered to. So these were not sort of the saviors of the world, carrying enlightened wisdom and humanity to every corner of the globe that perhaps on occasion they teach. And then I came across another writing, which was in 1857, just before the mutiny, as they call it, happened. And it was the Governor General, Lord Canning, who was speaking at that time. And he wrote, and it's recorded in Hansard, he wrote, "As we must rule 150 millions of people by a handful of Englishmen, let us do it in the manner best calculated to leave them divided, and to inspire them with the greatest possible awe of our power, and with the least possible suspicion of our motives." Now, to me, that sounds like a fairly comprehensive admission of intent, malice, and guilt. And so, yes, they set about an agenda to deconstruct, to asset strip, to exploit, and to extort as much as they could out from Bharat. And the consequences of their actions, as admitted by Middleton in his census notes, was that they created a horrific, abhorrent caste structure, which caused so much friction and has been seeded and has caused friction even to this day. It is one of the most powerful tropes that has ever been sculpted. And we're seeing how the seeds were planted so deep and across the globe that a little bit of nurturing, a little bit of watering over in a remote corner of the United States in Seattle, and suddenly there is a harvest of conflict and division and hatred and friction ready to be harvested. And this was a deliberate ploy, it was a deliberate strategy. And it's about time that we really do hold them to account. I've said it on occasion that this is such a toxic trope. There are only two tropes that I could think of which were attached to hate brands, which are possibly as pernicious, if not more pernicious. One is the N-word, which the African Americans have so successfully taken control of. They removed the power of that word by acquiring that word and denying its use to anybody else because it had so much hatred and history of violence attached to it. The second was the blood trope, the blood libel, that the Jews killed Christ and therefore they should forever be charged and be paying the price of that. And that trope led to so many genocides and murders across history and time. And the third trope that I've come across, which has been responsible for the suffering and the destruction of so many relationships and social structures and potential friendships even across all of India, across the last 258 years, is caste. And when somebody speaks to me with about this particular subject, and if they are not of an Indian origin, then I deny them the opportunity to talk to me about it. They do not have a locus standi on this. They have nothing to contribute towards us. We are a family who have been devastated by this trope. We are working to heal ourselves and to give each other support to stand up as a result of this trope. And a third party, especially a third party who has a history of mischief and malice, has no place in this conversation. We have to deny them the opportunity of running rampant in our wounds. And so that's something to take away as well.
You know, you mentioned your book. Well, I just wanted to show the viewers what it looks like in case they wanted to know more. And by the way, I do recommend it because there's something very interesting that you've written about, the Criminal Tribes Act. Can you explain it and how it created a category of people that were pretty much doomed from the day they were born?
Well, it's a remarkable period of history, and I don't know whether Deepika Ji has encountered it in her research. It was more in Madras, and I think it was in Bengal as well, in fact. The Bengal residency had a lot of experiences at the hands of this 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. In a nutshell, the British wanted a law which empowered them to seize assets, to seize wealth, to apply taxation, and to imprison and deconstruct willy-nilly. There were tribes who were particularly a thorn in their sides, and those tribes who were proud tribes with long history, held positions of authority and commanded respect in the communities. They were resistant to the British attempts to conquer and divide and tax. One particular tribe comes to my mind, and they were responsible for the transport of goods. And so imagine the degree of trust that was given to this tribe. They would receive the goods from the merchants. They would protect the goods as they were transported across the country, deposit them with the people who are going to eventually sell them, collect the monies, and then return back to the original manufacturers and make the payments. So these were people who were held with a great degree of trust and in high regard. The British wanted to tax the movement of goods. They wanted to tax it at the point of manufacture and tax it at the point of sale, which meant that this particular industry, this group, were a very major problem for them. And so they introduced this 1871 Criminal Tribes Act to introduce the idea of criminals by birth. In the same way that they have been proliferating this notion that humanity are sinners by birth, they proliferated the idea that there are some tribes who are criminals by birth. and being criminals by birth. Their ancestors were criminals, their descendants will be criminals. There is no cure for these people. That was the essence and the crux of this legislation. And it authorized them to seize assets and goods, but it also authorized them to create compounds outside of main urban areas and confine their movement to these compounds. These are concentration camps. And then should these people want to move from that concentration camp, they had to go to a designated British-appointed administrator and secure a pass to allow them to leave the concentration camps, go and do whatever they wanted to do, and then they'd have to show the pass. But one of the other particularly unpleasant aspects of being designated a criminal tribe was that you were not allowed to engage in the normal day-to-day trades that people would engage in. The only thing that they then had available to them, whereby they could sustain themselves, was the clearing of carcasses, the removal of dead bodies. And so they became the people who were producing the leather and doing the most unpleasant tasks. They created an underclass. And so they created people who they themselves then labeled as untouchables and told the world that it was a product of the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas and everybody else. And yet this is something that has yet to be acknowledged. It has yet to be explored. But it is a particularly painful development. And they, as I say, the 1871 Act, you can go and get it from Hansard, and it's crystal clear as to what the intent was. And remember, this is the same time period when these same people, the British, were wreaking havoc in Australia. They were destroying the cultures and civilizations across Africa, not to mention the Americas. And so it's the same mindset, it's the same ideology, it's the same intention. And if you have a look at some of the imagery that still is available from what was happening in the Americas, where they were still killing Indians, remember? It was Indians that they thought they were killing and destroying. There are pictures of mountains of skulls and all sorts of horrific demonic acts. And these were the people who then sculpted this 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. And they did it for our benefit. You know, they always write that there's a benefit, that this will introduce social mobility, it will introduce safety and security, it will make the nation a better place for all people concerned. And that's how they justified it. They did us a favor in creating criminal tribes.
You know, this should be compulsory reading for every Hindu child, because I know Hindu children here in the UK that when they're taught about the caste system as if it's a fact, they don't know how to respond. A lot more needs to be done to educate the average Hindu about the realities of this trope that is thrust upon them, which they have no comeback to.
Navitaji, one of the hardest things for me to do on this whole journey was to accept the possibility that such an evil mindset could exist in a human being. You know, good people struggle to understand what evil people are capable of. It was a journey into darkness and depravity. And on that journey, I also discovered that the phenomenon that you have just mentioned is actually an outcome which was a desirable outcome. And that is the alienation of subsequent generations from any emotional bonds to their ancestral civilization. You know, I've had this conversation with RE teachers in this country who were happily teaching caste until I shared with them some of the history. And when I said to them that what you're doing is you're actually traumatizing that child. Imagine that child sitting in a class of their peers. And you know at a young age how self-conscious everybody is, and how peer group pressure and the desire to conform and be respected, these are very, very powerful drivers. And when the whole class is told that your ancestors were discriminators and it was part of your religious tradition, a child is going to feel a sense of revulsion, and it's a natural response to it. And I would suggest, and I suggested, that this was not accidental. This was intentional. This was by design, and it needs to stop. And every religious or RE teacher I've spoken to in this country, once they've understood this, they're as horrified as any normal, decent person would be, and they stop teaching caste in schools. So hopefully we'll come to the day when it is completely removed from syllabuses, except those syllabuses where we decide it should be taught in its fullness and its appropriate context. And that's necessary for our healing and for our children to heal as well.
Very, very aptly put. I think, I can't remember who it was. I think it was you, Panditji. You mentioned Seattle, that's passed a new law in which caste has been added as a protected class. Now, this law apparently was fast-tracked through the system without any credible evidence to support it. Basically relies upon a report by Equality Labs, which is an organization funded by a Soros-style billionaire called Pierre Omidyar. And actually, we have a very excellent interview of Suhag Shukla of the Hindu American Foundation, where she describes how faulty that report is, with serious sampling biases and huge conflicts of interest. And we're going to put the link to that video in the description below. So if anyone's interested, do watch it. It's a very current issue. Now, Panditji and Deepikaji, if that ruling by Seattle remains unchallenged, what would be the potential wider implications for Hindu society, or just Hindus in general?
Deepikaji, your thoughts?
Before I give my thoughts on that, I just had a little comment on what Panditji's idea about, not idea, but his stated facts about the Criminal Tribes Act. I just want to make it clear to Indians, because they also seem not to be very clear on this, is the fact that India was ruled directly by the British in certain parts where these laws would apply directly, but it was ruled by native Indians, the princes, or what the British call the princes, and about 1/3 of India by independence was still ruled by India, which means that these laws did not apply there, which is why I can say that within the business of precious cargo carrying, Panditji, you must know that community still exists in India today. So these are people who are entrusted with millions and millions worth of goods on trust, and they go and transmit them, get payments, etc., etc. So there are many communities in India like this who survive because India was not, thankfully, with the grace of God, not completely ruled by the British for those traumatic years of colonization. And for many parts of India, especially the parts that I specialize in, their colonial influence was only about like 40, 50 years, because the British hadn't got their dirty little claws on it till the 1870s. So we were very lucky. But large parts of India, like Bengal, the Madras Presidency, etc., were not. And the caste law that you mentioned, to me, it would be a travesty, because it is essentially trying to retroactively construct a world based on a faulty narrative about a reality. Their understanding of caste is not based on any ground reality. And if you wish to judge that, then please look outside. If you're in India, go look outside and find a Brahmin who's telling your parents what to do, or who's telling your teacher what to do, or your employer what to do. This is supposedly the caste system, right? A Brahmin tells everybody, hey, you do this and that. If you can find such a Brahmin for me, then believe in this caste system. Otherwise, look around you and say, what are the Brahmins doing? Do you have a system of judgmani, for example? The Brahmins are white-collar professionals. They perform a multiplicity of knowledge-based roles once you hire them to do it. So the people who pay them are the ones who, it's a service, like a professor today. So would you consider all professors to be diabolical because they are the ones who deal with words? Those are the parallels you need to think about. Think sensibly about what you've been told, and that would be a start. So the caste ruling is based on an imperfect, and not just imperfect, but erroneous understanding of reality and life in India, and therefore it needs to be challenged extremely vigorously until the understanding of caste parallels, at least, what is the ground reality of social hierarchy and social differentiation in India.
I'd add to what Deepikaji has just portrayed so well. One dimension, and as I said, for us, with every step into depravity, it takes us a bit of time to acknowledge that, did they really think like this? Because it is such an incredibly cunning mindset which has done this. Just think about all of the presuppositions which are necessary before you get to pass something like this Seattle law. Okay, firstly, each inalienable human rights, each person is presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. Okay, except the Brahmin, the Kshatriya, and the Vaishya in this particular scenario. You're presumed to be guilty and your innocence has to be proven. But in addition to that, there are two dimensions of injustice which I'm stunned that legislators haven't noticed. And the first is the completely illegal concept of ancestral guilt. Either you have inalienable rights, which are yours by birth and from birth, or you have some sort of burden of carrying the sins of your fathers and forefathers, and mothers and foremothers, I guess, right? And if you accept that as a principle, that it's possible to deem a particular group to be guilty and in need of punishment because of the acts of their forefathers, then what do we do with all of the Christians? All of the Christians are guilty of the most horrific crimes in every corner of the world. Is this the principle that's being established here? So we have those two principles. One is ancestral guilt, and that's clearly a nonsense. And then we have group guilt, which is equally a nonsense. And yet both of those two principles are the foundational principles upon which this caste issue and legislating for caste actually is established. It's that ridiculous. And I'm stunned that they would succumb to such tales of victimhood which had no evidence base to support them. And this is where they are going to tumble and fall, because once the shock has passed and reality dawns, they will understand that they were the targets of master orators who sold a completely false account of the reality. And I would suggest that the Seattle legislators have been, shall we say, deceived as much as everybody else has. They're also victims in this. I mean, I've not come across a legislator who wants to be responsible for creating bad law. And yet there are very few laws which are as bad as this.
They do really need to read a little bit more diverse literature. I think that would be really helpful. But unfortunately, people don't like reading in today's world. They prefer TikTok information and tweets from, sort of, hey, I'm so offended by life kind of people. Unfortunately, that is our reality. But unless it is fought vigorously, it essentially puts bad law into practice. In context, I also wish to say that this is the first time there is an immense amount of India probably has the world's largest body of positive discrimination based on underrepresented, disempowered communities who have been historically disempowered for various reasons. There is also a logical fallacy at play here. So if people are saying India was a scriptural-led society, and because this book or this text says so, India must have systemic discrimination, why do they not believe the fact that when we have a constitution with the largest body of positive discrimination, why do they not believe that India exactly follows that constitution and therefore has no discrimination at all today? Do you not think there's a fundamental logical fallacy here?
Completely. And yet it's so straightforward and so obvious when you put it in that way. And yet politician after politician, legislator after legislator, theologian after theologian, historian after historian, academic after academic haven't noticed.
There's also another irony in all of this, isn't there? Because we live in a time when personal self-identity is given center stage. So if a man says he identifies as a woman, everyone's obliged to respect that. Yet we have hundreds of millions of Hindus who don't necessarily identify with the word caste. Yet you have a law being passed that forces them into a caste box. Banerjee, how would you square that circle? Because it seems there's a level of disconnect, almost like a willful hypocrisy even.
Well, I think it is, as I said earlier, malice. This cannot possibly be incompetence. Right? This cannot be a failure to dive into the legal principles at work and not notice these incredible fallacies. And therefore one has to draw a conclusion that this is malicious. And then you enter into the space of the great game and the desire to dominate the world, to commit ethnocide and remove all pagan civilizations. And sadly, we still do have very powerful entities for whom this is their daily mantra. And they certainly have the capacity, wherewithal, and desire to do this. And that is the only conclusion that a logical, reasonable person will come to. It has to be malice. And that is a shocking statement to recognize. It's a position which really warrants that every Hindu, and not only every Hindu, but every member of the formerly colonized world, every member of the First Nations, would do well to sit back and consider the reality of what is still being done. That, I think, is our next step. We really do need to start to articulate our analysis of why this is being done, what the motivations could be, and then perhaps, as the former Archbishop of Canterbury said, he said the wonderful thing about India is that it holds a mirror to us, and it requires us to consider our own flaws and faults. And I think for this, India and certainly the other First Nations are fully justified in holding the biggest mirror possible to the colonizer nations and the colonizer ideologies and saying, this is what we see. Please face this yourselves, address it, deal with it, so that everybody can move forward. But we can't afford to ignore it anymore.
I think I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think it's also useful to remember who in this world, which ideology wants to homogenize the world into a certain system of belief at this point.
Yes, it's. I would say that there are battles of two ideologies who have a history of both ethnocide, whether it's the destruction of the Brahmin Buddhas or the terrible assault on Hypatia, long, deep histories of desecration of what was sacred and beautiful. And they are still very present and very active.
Indeed.
What do you think Hindus could do? Because you mentioned that the African Americans and the Jews have been quite successful in taking control of the narrative tropes that were thrust upon them. What could Hindus do to take back control of this caste narrative that seeks to pigeonhole them without their permission, against their wishes, and worse still, to pit one group of Hindus against another, almost like feeding directly into the Breaking India plan as described by Rajiv Malhotraji? How do we take back that caste narrative, take control of it?
Well, I think we can. One of the most encouraging developments is that we now have two generations of Indian origin citizens, both in India and globally, who have mastered the English language to such a degree that they can articulate to the colonizer nations exactly what it is they have done and push them back a little bit to give us civilizational elbow room. So that's a very positive, not our own civilizational elbow room to do this. I think we need to turn to our own brothers and sisters, our own family members, all of whom have been victims of this externally imposed feud. And it's the classic Shakespearean sort of drama, isn't it? There was Othello with Iago, who was in the middle of the family plotting to wreak havoc and create friction. In a more contemporary setting, we had Grima Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings for the younger people. This is a classic role of the person whose job is to wreak havoc through divide and rule. And so once we have ejected representatives of those mischievous traditions, when we have confined them in their own intellectual criminal tribes type encampments, then we turn to our own family members and face the trauma of what it is that is left. There is a huge amount of trauma on all sides, and this is going to be a difficult task. But I think we can do this. And once we have done that and family wounds start to heal, then I think we can collectively turn to the outside world and then face those who have done this and hold them to account. And the formula that I would use, and I insist on this whenever I'm speaking in situations where justice is being considered, is that first there must be recognition. The perpetrators must recognize what it was that they did. Then there must be an expression of remorse. After remorse, there must be some sort of an act, whether it's moral or whether it's in terms of whatever the value is that was acquired through violence, of restitution or reparation. That has to be done. And then we have reconciliation. What is not acceptable is to leap from recognition right the way through to what would seem to be reconciliation, because that's not authentic and it's not genuine. That is the scoundrel's approach. That, okay, right, we got it wrong. Our ancestors have built a world which is still benefiting us, but let's forget all of that and look forward to the future. That's a disingenuous, dishonest position. And that, I think, will be available to us once we ourselves have healed. And I see signs of this healing in many, many places. It's happening, it's occurring.
Is there a role for the state structure to play in India to play here? Because it seems like they've continued the same old colonial tactics to divide and rule, except now it's used for vote bank politics.
Deepika ji, do you have any contemporary study on this?
The only thing I would say is that words have power, and I think one of the ways that we start doing this is by stop using the word that was foisted upon us. So we have to stop talking about caste during elections. If you want to talk about a social stratification and social identification that are indigenous, Jati is your word. Please use Jati. There is no parallel in the English language. Use Jati instead. That would be a beginning.
What a wonderful and simple starting point. And yet, as Deepika ji has said, words have power, and it's so powerful. I see a solution to this. I wanted to have an idea in my mind. What would a solution look like? And how would it then be described? And the phrase that keeps springing to my mind is that we have to dissolve caste consciousness. And I speak of caste consciousness, not Jati consciousness. I'm perfectly comfortable with the idea of anybody in any Jati being absolutely proud of what their ancestors have done, proud of the knowledge that they have preserved over millennia. There is no harm in pride and in diversity. These are the building blocks of our traditions. It's only harmful when the concept of a hierarchy, or indeed when the concept of prejudice based on hierarchy creeps in. And we do not have that in our DNA. Or fixed
hierarchy, because I think hierarchy is as I mentioned before, a perfectly equal society has been impossible, even though people have tried to engineer it by murdering millions in our very recent human history. Hierarchy in human societies will occur, no matter however small, homogeneous, wealthy they are, like say the Scandinavian countries, they will still have a degree of hierarchy. That's human nature. Fixed hierarchy is something that has not been the case in India, and we should not try to impose that as a reality on India. That is a shame, and it is an injustice upon us.
As an example, you would be referring to things like the European royal families, fixed hierarchy.
Yes, the European feudal system has a fixed hierarchy. There's also, and in terms of social hierarchies, of course, there are many parallels across the world. People say, oh, this parallels the Indian caste system, again, based on an erroneous idea of Indian caste system. This is the Confucian order of scholar, warrior, farmer, trader, which is found in many Confucian societies, including in Korea, China before the revolution, etc., etc. But these are not caste systems. These are Varnic orders, in fact. These are Varnic orders. Calling them a caste system is a travesty. It's pushing a wrong on another wrong.
If I can just pick that point up, I'm often reminded that Brahmins are at the top of this caste hierarchy. And I always say to them, okay, well, could you tell me the metric that you're using to measure top and bottom? And of course, there isn't one, because it's a complete nonsense. The only metric, and I mentioned this in my book, that I ever found which was consistently applicable was the level of threat to the colonizers and specifically to their religious missionaries. And the Brahmins were always the highest threat, as were the African witch doctors, as they were denigratingly called, as were the wise women of Europe who held the herbal traditions, the medicine traditions. Each and every one of these was the highest threat to missionary activity through theocracies which wanted to control power. And so they designated the highest threat as being the highest in the appropriate social structure. If you want a more contemporary example, it's worth studying what was done in Rwanda when the Roman Catholic Church did exactly what they have done to really apply a divide and rule strategy. And it was 800,000 deaths later that the Rwandans then slowly paused and reflected on what had been done. And the Roman Catholic Church issued an apology for its role in the Rwanda genocide. They have yet to admit their role in multiple genocides, but the toolkit is exactly the same. The policy is exactly the same. The British mastered it, as in their own records we see this, and this is why they are known internationally for their divide and rule policies.
That's a great parallel you just described, between the Brahmins and the African witch doctors being at the top because they're top of being the highest threat to the colonizers.
And it was a ready-made trope, wasn't it? You had these terrible women all across Europe who, remember, were responsible for original sin, which makes them all criminal at birth, a familiar sort of refrain. And what did you do? Designate them as witches. When you came across the same traditions of knowledge in the African areas, well, you called them witch doctors. You just transposed that same trope with all of its negative hatred. And that brand becomes a portable brand and applied it to the African knowledge traditions. And so, yes, the priests, the Bharatiya Brahmins and the educators, they were a logical next step in this march of madness.
And that's why they're being so vilified and attacked today.
Well, it's that famous statement, isn't it? When the slave whips themselves, then the master's work is done. And what we sadly have is a whole civilization. Bharat is still replete with people who are engaged in doing the master's bidding, even though they don't know that that's what they're doing. And so, like I said, once we have the space to deal with this, we will then turn to our own brethren and heal these wounds and embrace each other, support each other, and then look outwards and rebuild Bharat in the manner in which our ancestral arc and the direction in which our ancestral civilizational arc was taking us.
That's great. Such a positive way to end the discussion. Deepika ji, do you have any final closing thoughts before we
No,
conclude?
I agree with Pandit ji that let India run itself would be a great way to. Indians are capable of doing it. They've done it for thousands of years. And I just wanted to add that also destroying the Brahmin, because so much of knowledge was not written down. You cut off a Brahmin's head, you can cut off the entire knowledge of a civilization, which has happened a couple of times in India. So that is why the Brahmin heads are important. And the vilification of Brahmins has been such a trope of trying to conquer India, which has been a constant sort of idea for the rest of the world for a very long time.
Yeah, so I think sounds like we should get back to Jati and Varna and dissolve caste consciousness, as you said, Panditji.
Navitaji, we have no choice. Varna is a darshan. If you look at any family, you will find that there are people who are intellectual, there are people who are courageous, you'll find that there are people who are naturally wanting to do business. You know, you get a 12-year-old who buys a packet of Mars bars from the local cash and carry store and then sells them in his school to his friends. You know, they're completely different archetypes, and they are natural because each of those functions is vital for any society to function. We cannot get away from Varna because it's part of who we are as beings, as a species. And so the sooner we learn to try and identify a person's Varna, which is what happens in every interview. Every job interview is a job interviewer trying to establish what the Varna of the person in front of them is. Once we can identify it, we then have a society whose job is to help elevate it to its heights so that the person is feeling fulfilled according to their aptitudes. And we try and make them fit into society so their skill set contributes the maximum to society. This is what Varna Vyavastha is. It's an observation. It's a darshan, as opposed to an intellectually constructed scheme such as socialism and capitalism and all of those isms. They've emerged from mind. This has emerged from vision. And so, yes, Bharat will get back to that place.
And it is an individual-based system, which we can see from the many illustrations of the Vishapurush idea. And I want to look at the people who sort of think, oh yes, because the Brahmin is written on the head, it means that he is superior. And the Shudra is written on the feet, he's somehow inferior. And I like to see these people wanting to go around without feet. How can you look at a body and think, oh, the head is more important? I mean, how can you have a body and have that idea that somehow any part of the body is less important or less than another body part? So even with that perfect illustration of the Varna system, they managed to completely misunderstand it.
It just shows there's a motivated agenda behind all of this. I mean, what else can you say? Both of you have been so brilliant in explaining and giving us your insights on this issue. I just want to say a big thank you to you for a very enlightening discussion, and I hope the viewers have found it an educative experience. So with that, we're going to say namaste and see you next time.
Jai Shri Ram.
Thank you both.
Jai Mataji.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.